everybody. Whoa, okay, kind of loud. First off, you guys are, I don't always do this, but you guys are so beautiful, I got to take a quick picture. So can everybody just quickly wave, say hello, Gdańsk? Hello? Okay, now you are all on Twitter. So hopefully that's not the last tweet of my panel or my discussion. I really want to talk to you guys today about how to predict the future of marketing and communications. And I think it's critical. I'm biased because essentially what I need to be doing on an everyday basis is to be a little bit of a short-term futurist. I have to be thinking, what's going to be happening next? Okay, that's essentially how I advise people. And this is why this is really critical. Does anybody know, let me see, who this is up here? Anybody? Probably not, because this is an obscure XMen character, and you were all probably more popular than me in high school, so you didn't read comics as much. She has the mutant ability, Destiny, to tell the future, to predict the future. And I always thought that that was the best possible power to have, because you can win everything, and you would be, outstanding, because you would always be one step ahead, okay? And we can't do that. Nobody has a mutant power like that, but there are a lot of other things that we can do to get ahead, and it doesn't necessarily involve, it's not rocket science. It's not something that none of us can do. All of us can do this. So I'm going to teach a little bit of a system about how to actually accomplish that. So a little bit about Firebrand. Essentially what we do is my company helps people create innovative brands that are going to be working in the marketplace in the present. And then naturally, over time, we started thinking, what do we have to do in order to teach people better so that they can be one step ahead? And that's essentially what we focus on now, is future-proofing other brands. Now, in order to do that, there are a few different steps, and I want to teach you some of the steps. So the first off, you have to be a sponge, okay? You have to really absorb things and be willing to constantly absorb. The very fact that you are all here at Infoshare means that you're one step ahead of other people. So can you just for a second give yourselves, not me, you guys, can you please give yourselves a round of applause for being here? Please, thank you. I see one person not doing it, but it's okay. It's okay. Now, some of the ways to actually become a sponge, there are a number of different ways. These are some of my favorite things to do, okay? Feedly for consuming RSS feeds, because I can consume as much information as about 150 articles a day. Slack, Reddit, which is great because Reddit actually surfaces a lot of information I wouldn't otherwise be able to find. Listservs in general, again, along the same lines as Reddit, and actually Audible and Stitcher. One thing is, anybody else have pets here? I have 5 on any given day, and walking the dogs takes a lot of time, and I wouldn't be able to read during that time or my commute. But actually, just being able to read about one more book every single week means I'm reading, but through my ears, 52 extra books a year, okay? Not to mention a lot of podcasts. All of that information consumption lets you absorb a lot of different perspectives, not just perspectives that you agree with, but things that you would totally disagree with, but then enhance your way of thinking. So you're actually exposed to new ideas. Also, interviewing thought leaders. I have, like a lot of people you've heard today, have a podcast where I'm actually interviewing people, and it's a sneaky, evil thing that I do. I'll be totally honest that I am an evil human being, and the reason why is because I'm taking their thoughts and I'm absorbing them, and I'm becoming better and more competitive in the marketplace as a result. Attending conferences like this, like I said, very important. I even helped throw one last year back in New York, where I'm from, and all of that goes to becoming a little bit more of a sponge. Now, another key thing is it wouldn't be a presentation involving digital marketing if you didn't have some cats in it, okay? So the laser ability to focus on one particular idea is critical, right? Rather than asking something very broad when we're trying to figure something out, if you can laser focus on one particular thing and not look away, then you can wind up being a lot more successful. So we had somebody who hired us recently and this was interesting. They wanted to know, what will the future of social media look like over the next few years? And then we said, well, that is not specific at all. I mean, how do you define that question? Let's try to focus it, okay? So then they were like, well, what if we have, a few different clicks here went through. What does the future of Snapchat look like? Because they really wanted to focus on Snapchat. And then, well, again, that's way too broad. How do I actually answer that question? How about their advertising capabilities? And then more specifically, what will their advertising revenue look like? Because this was a company that wanted to invest in Snapchat, millions of dollars actually in their common stock, but also they wanted to advertise on Snapchat. So actually focusing and honing in on the right question makes it a lot easier for us to answer and to spend the finite amount of time all of us have as developers, as executives, as investors, of figuring out where we should be allocating our time and where we should be, not focusing. Now, another key thing that I recommend whenever possible is to break down a problem as much as possible into smaller components. Now, this is something that I think a lot of us don't necessarily think about. We just say, well, we have a problem to solve, right? Let's go to solving it. But actually, if you have a finite amount of time to address a particular problem, then let's break it down into smaller questions. And this is one thing that when you're looking at time, you can say, like, how much revenue are they going to have, to take the Snapchat example, in Q4, right? And you can apply this to anything, such as, will augmented reality be big in your industry? Or will virtual reality take my job or make me obsolete in a few years? Or which technology should I invest in as an investor? You might have a question like this, and you can say, I'm going to spend 100% of my time here. Or what I can do is let me break it down into smaller questions that will help me get to the ultimate answer in the end, okay? If I can do that, then I might be wrong by 10% one way or another on one of these questions. And then I might be exactly right on another portion, and I might be off by 5% on another. But ultimately, if you break down a question, then you're going to wind up getting much closer to the actual truth and ahead of your competitors, which is ultimately the name of the game. Now, another key thing that I feel strongly about, besides teamwork, but also the movie Anchorman, so there might be more than one reference here. Teamwork is critical, okay? If you are very good and one of the more sophisticated, intelligent members of your team, great. There might be somebody at work that you don't quite agree with all of the time, all right? That happens to all of us. But what's interesting is that if you team up with people who have opposing points of view, you still might wind up with a better prediction and a better forecast in the end than if you didn't incorporate their point of view. If you beat up one another's ideas, that can be very beneficial. So they actually had this book, Super Forecasters, a few years ago, great book. And they looked, they had UC Berkeley and the University of Pennsylvania look together at people who were really great super forecasters, and they found that the teams of super forecasters were quite good at predicting the future. They were so good, by the way, that they were better than US intelligence community experts who were being paid large sums of money to answer particular questions. These people who had these traits of really great teamwork did better than people who were paid to solve these issues who went to very good schools, So that's the power of collaboration and the power of getting really great people together to solve something. Now, another key thing is there's obviously a lot of work in figuring out where the future of augmented reality is going, or how deep learning and AI will intersect with particular industries and what effect that will have on the workforce. All of these questions that we try to solve, we do it using first-party data, second-party, and third-party. So let me just very quickly talk about that. When we're talking about first-party data, that's actually something that I feel like a lot of us, This might get a few popping up at the same time. So first-party data is something I feel like most of us have in some way, shape, or form. It's your customer file. It's all of the information that you have directly from the people that you've worked with, okay? Now, third-party is something I think also a lot of people have, so it's not necessarily a big deal. It's aggregated data that you can generally find that's publicly available. You don't necessarily have a relationship with whoever's provided it, right? Now, how many people actively use or even have heard of the term second-party data? Okay. So the great news is that, once again, you're ahead of everybody who you're competing with if you know about this and nobody else does, okay? This is, generally speaking, second-party data is a huge competitive advantage because you can put together a data partnership with somebody that you've worked with in the past, or you can put together a new partnership, and essentially what it is where you're getting direct access to their data. And in exchange, you might be paying, they might be getting access to your data as well. But one of the key things is that we and myself, I've been fortunate enough to get access to lots of different second-party data sources where I have a lot of information about where the data comes from, and then I can actually get a more accurate view of the world. Now, that's fantastic because as somebody who runs a digital consulting firm, if all I have is information about everybody who I've worked with, you know, that's kind of okay. But if I can get 15 other digital consultancies to give me their information and anonymize it, all of a sudden, I have much better information than anybody who doesn't have that. And that gives me a tremendous competitive advantage. And try to think about how you can actually use that in your daily lives. Now, one thing that we always try to look for whenever possible is to find a bit of the needle in the haystack, if you will. Let's see. Yep. So needle in the haystack, critical. Now, this is something that I think a lot of people, when you're trying to think critically about solving a problem, you might pour through all of the data, you're looking at everything, and then you get a little bit excited when you see a particular interesting observation. And the problem is that sometimes there's something very major, I call this the needle in the haystack, where you can find something that nobody else in your industry has found, and it doesn't matter that you can find 10 kind of interesting but not necessarily world-changing aspects of the data. If you look at data critically and you find one amazing observation, that's all you need. You know? If you look at Airbnb, if you look at Uber, if you look at other disruptive companies nowadays, they don't find a way to do everything 4% better than other people, right? They're trying to find one thing, one amazing observation when they sift through data and they say, for instance, I see that there's a huge opportunity here, then that takes them pretty far. And that's one thing that I recommend to everybody here is try to think, how can you find the needle in the haystack in your industry? Now, the inverse of that is to be kind of a cat with a laser pointer, where you just play around with the laser pointer and the cat follows it, and you get sidetracked, and you're all of a sudden focused on something entirely different other than what you should focus on. It goes back to the idea of having a critical eye and a laser focus on solving one particular problem. Do not get sidetracked when you're trying to predict something, because as you're accumulating a lot of data sources, you might wind up going off on a totally different path than where you're trying to get to. Now, so another Anchorman reference. It's very important to anchor something when you're trying to make an estimate and figure out how big something's going to be. And let me give you an example. How many people do you think are at Infoshare today? Like 1,000? How many? Just throw out some numbers. 5,000. OK, so one thing that's interesting, you guys did better than a lot of people. When you anchor something, you have to pick the right anchor. You have to pick the right number to begin with. Because what I've found is that if you throw out a number that is particularly low, then people's estimates naturally, subconsciously, people don't want to sound like idiots. So as a result, they lower their estimates even though they shouldn't, because I think some of the numbers I heard were a lot higher, and they're correct. I believe it's about 8,000 or 7,000. So that's something that I think we all have to be mindful of, is when you're trying to forecast how big augmented reality will be in 2021, or if you're trying to figure out how big chat will be in Poland in 2020 and in a particular industry, you have to have the right anchor, the right number that you're beginning with, and then you try to get to the perfect number afterwards. Now, this is a movie probably nobody here gets because I want to throw in some really obscure references. This is the movie Dogma. And I say this because all of us have some type of dogmatic belief, right? We have things that we hold on to, and that can be sometimes very dangerous when you're trying to be a futurist in some way. If you're trying to have a perfect forecast or prediction about what's going to happen in your industry, what that means is that you can't be holding on to a political belief or a religious belief or anything like that as you're putting this together. You have to, and perfect example, by the way, is when I'm trying to figure out how big Snapchat's going to be for that client I mentioned before, I had to throw out and get out of my head the fact that I don't use Snapchat anymore, okay? I use Instagram stories all of the time. And the problem is that that bias can creep into my thinking. That's something that we can't do if you want to have an accurate estimate, right? So speaking of that, on a scale of 1 to 10, I'm going to ask you guys to throw out a number. How overrated is Elon Musk? 1 to 10. So what's very interesting, okay, about this question is that I can skew this question, right, which maybe I would do some analysis on afterwards. If I wanted to have a really bad article about people think that Elon Musk is overrated, I can take all the observations I got right now, and I would throw them into an article and say, hey, listen, I spoke to people, I asked them this question, this is what they said. But if I asked the question, how underrated is he, 1 to 10, people would also give actually very different answers. And it's all in how you ask the question, which is why if you're hiring a company to do research, or if you're finding research online, like I know everybody here has done at some point, you find research and you don't even look at the methodology to figure out how it was put together. And that can be very problematic as well. So generally speaking, you have to vet your information sources. And if you're asking a question directly, you have to make sure that you're asking the question properly. Now, skewing results is kind of on the opposite side of that. So if you have data sources, you want to make sure that those are good data sources. But if you're analyzing information yourself, you have to make sure that you don't skew things. I've seen people do this all the time, where you might find 3 different data sources because you're trying to, let's say, convince a client that chatbots are going to be 4 times bigger next year. And you find 2 articles and surveys that agree with you that you want to cite. And then you find a third that disagrees with what you were, that argument you're making. You have to include that third one. If you throw that one out, then you're going to make it look like you're right. And if you're going to make it look like you're right, then you're going to get people to invest in something that actually the aggregate of information out there says actually it's not going to be as big as you're predicting. So you really have to try to not skew your results by throwing out data that you disagree with if the methodology is right. And this is, I think, also a very important thing for us to understand, which is, as human beings, we are terrific at storytelling. We are very, very good at that. We told, for instance, a really great story about how one street peddler of goods lit themselves on fire as part of the Arab Spring, and then it led, basically, to Tunisia and all over. We had the Arab Spring, and it all started because of one particular event, right? All started because of that. And we tell the story afterwards, and the issue is that just means we're very good at storytelling. We're very good at going backwards and creating some type of narrative. The challenge there is we're so good at that we don't acknowledge that we're actually not that great at predicting the future. In fact, we actually have a lot of people who get on television all the time, And one thing that's interesting, these are, I believe, mainly American sources, but they're on television all of the time, and they make very bold predictions about what's going to happen. About President Hillary Clinton was a very popular thing for everybody to talk about before she did not win. And people like this, they generally get on TV for making bold predictions, for telling stories really well. But the issue is that you never see their average, okay? How many people here like European football, real football? Anybody? Okay, I know a lot more of you like it than raise your hand. So if you actually had a team and you didn't know what their win-loss record was, that would be ridiculous. Every time they show a team, they have in parentheses their win-loss record. For these pundits, they don't actually do that. And I think that in some ways this is dangerous because for all of us, as we're trying to become a little bit of a futurist in a way, we are always trying to look to see what we can learn from the famous pundits. And the problem is that if you want to be accurate, you should not be trying to learn from these people, because most of the time when you put together the win-loss records for very famous people, it's not that good. They're famous because they're really good at being famous, not because they're really good necessarily at being futurists. Often, you have people who made one or two really big calls, and they were correct on that front, and everywhere else they haven't been right. So you have to take that with a bit of a grain of salt. Now, if you want to be a technologist who's also a futurist, it's important to not try to be bold, but really to try to be realistic. You don't have to say, actually, my prediction is that augmented reality is going to die and nobody's going to be using it by 2021. You don't have to do that. You can say, actually, I believe it's going to grow by 17% in the European Union, and here's my data to back it up. It doesn't have to be so sexy, your prediction. It just has to be right. Now, one other thing that I want to show you is, whoops, sorry. See if we can do this. So with Pinball, it's also important to acknowledge how much is out of our control. It's a little bit hard to try to figure out necessarily that if I hit the flipper in one particular way, it's going to bounce over this wall, and then it's going to go there, then it's going to go there. It's not so easy for us to predict all these different things. But often, it's actually something that you can start to think about and to backtrack a few different steps, okay? So perfect example is when I'm trying to think about, with my wife, who traveled here with me, if I want to think, well, okay, I can buy her a present before I see her again, and then if I do that, then she'll be nice to me tonight. And then if she's nice to me tonight, I'll have a good time on the cruise tomorrow, okay? It's very important to follow logically through all these different steps and say, if this happens, then what is the logical conclusion, okay? If my company invests in one particular new social platform, what is the net impact? Well, maybe the net impact is that we're going to grow on this new platform, but also we're going to have less time to spend on Twitter, and 15% of our revenue right now comes from Twitter. So you can't just look positively, you have to look at the unintended consequences of every action that you're taking. And sometimes it's very hard to predict the future. Like, for instance, me connecting to AOL over dial-up about 20 years ago led me to meet my best friend, and then her friends met my wife's friends, and then two of those friends wound up dating on and off for a bunch of years. And then this kid, Victor, awesome little dude, exists because of that random decision to go into a chat room in one particular night, okay? There's a lot of randomness, so you can't get everything right. You can't predict everything. But there is the idea of the butterfly effect, which was coined in, I believe, 1972. And this is the idea that you can have a butterfly that's flapping its wings off the coast of Africa, and then it could lead to a volcanic eruption through a number of different things that have happened in between. It can lead to a volcanic eruption hundreds of miles away, right? We can never get to be as sophisticated as being able to predict that butterfly that's going to lead to the volcanic eruption. But we can get a lot closer than we give ourselves credit for, okay? whenever there's something that's happening in the economy, or whenever there's a particular issue such as, what if there's a baby boom and childbirths are going up 300% unexpectedly? That's something that you can say, well, you know what? I think it probably makes sense to try to see what are the technologies that children are going to need. Maybe that's something I should invest in. Maybe there are new social platforms that I should be focused on. Maybe there are new types of jobs that I need to be hiring for, and I need to hire those people today because it's going to be harder to figure out where to hire those people tomorrow. So I have to get ahead of the crowd, okay? And to think along the lines of the butterfly effect, and to think, what are the things that I can try to predict? Even if I'm not perfect at it, if I'm thinking critically in that manner, I'm going to be a lot better than other people. And then, if you get everything right, then often, you might wind up being very, very successful and very happy, and essentially, treated like a champion. And often you can do that. It's not easy, but you can do it if you get enough things right. And you don't have to be perfect. You just have to be more perfect than everybody you're competing with. But sometimes when you don't get things right, you wind up with egg on your face, okay? And that's not ideal. Nobody's happy when that happens. But you know what? We're human. And sometimes it's even worse than that. Sometimes you essentially fall flat on your ass, okay? And when that happens, that's not the end of the world. The important thing to do is to do a postmortem. So I don't really have time to necessarily show you the final few slides, but I'm going to breeze through them just to show you a little bit of the process and action of what we try to do. And if anybody tweets me later, I'll send them the survey results I'm going to show. So what we basically did is we tried to figure out what agencies and what brands are going to be spending time on over the next few years. We partnered with a firm that we use to vet all of our research through, Provoke Insights. They do great stuff. And we basically look to see what ad agencies and what brands are going to be spending their money on. One thing that we've noticed as we've done this survey over a few years now is that if you have agencies that are working with, let's say, Facebook or augmented reality publishers, and anybody who's providing a technology, the agencies tend to adapt and adopt these technologies first. So we took a look to see what were going to be the learning goals for these companies. What were they going to be interested in focusing on over the next few years? And we found that content marketing was something that really everybody felt that they had to be spending more time on, but that VR, AR, and then how artificial intelligence could power their enterprises forward, those were all things that were very critical to them as well. But we needed to not just look at necessarily what their learning goals are, okay, but what actual technologies were they looking to integrate in this particular moment? All right, this is something that I think has been very critical in helping us understand where the future of marketing is going. And you see that content marketing, once again, is something that is kind of, as they say, the bread and butter. It's very concrete. It's very strong still for a lot of people in terms of how they understand and how they want to go about their marketing over the next few years. But what we found is that geolocation, interestingly, was bigger. And it's something that a lot of retailers, a lot of people who have physical locations have spent a lot of time on trying to understand over the last few years. And then we wanted to look to see not just what had they put together, what had they implemented, but what were their plans going forward from an implementation standpoint. The reason why this is very interesting and very critical for us is that if we notice something that was being implemented a lot last year, but then all of a sudden isn't being implemented that much this year, generally what that means is people haven't found the return on investment or the business use case. Because a lot of enterprises, they'll do a test and learn. They'll do something, and then they'll realize that actually the time is not yet right for this. We saw this, frankly, with VR 5 years ago, where we had a lot of people who did test and learns to try to figure out if it was applicable to their business, and the answer was not yet. So that got them a little bit shy about implementing it in the near term. And then just the last thing is that implementations to learn about technology. Where were people spending their time over the next few the next few months? Audio and voice technologies and trying to find ways to do that was actually a really critical part of the study. But then content marketing to learn a little bit more about how to make that work, that was actually incredibly big for brands, which are generally a little bit later adopters than agencies. So ultimately, could go on, but I know we have a really great day for you guys. So I just want to thank you all for being here, and please tweet me, email me, any questions anytime. Thanks again.
Ladies and gentlemen, hands together for Jeremy Goldman.